Thanks everyone for coming. It's funny because 4 or 5 weeks ago, first of all, I introduced myself. My name is Shani. I'm with Bunnyshell, and I think many of you got emails from me, so I apologize for that, but then I guess you showed up, so maybe I shouldn't. 4 or 5 weeks ago, I met Jeff in San Francisco, where I'm based, and he said I might be coming to Israel in the summer, and I said, well, if you come to Israel, I'm going to be there, and let's grab dinner. But I also said, well, maybe we should organize something, and I'm also involved in a company called Notorious, and Ronen will introduce himself in a second. But that kind of it's amazing how we started working on that less than 4 weeks ago. So it's amazing to see how this came through. So first of all, before we start, I want to give a big round of applause to all that made this happen, especially Stav and Ronen and Jeff and Darian and Roxana and Avi and all the others. So give them a round of applause. And I'd like to introduce Ronen. Ronen is the CEO of Notorious, and I'll let him say a few words.
Thank you, Shani. So good evening, very cool evening. Not the 47 degrees. I'm Ronen, I'm the CEO of Notorious. And in a few words about Notorious, Notorious was built on frustration from data. The founders of Notorious had a lot of dealing with data in different domains. And we met that data is hard to manage, hard to make value out of. 50% of the data in the world is spilled on the floor, mainly because they are waiting in the backlog for pipelines to be built, or there are pipelines that are broken or that are waiting to be fixed. And the other thing is that pipelines are quite boring to design. And we think that technology should replace things that are boring to design. And that's the frustration that Notorious built on. We're building a self-serve data platform that takes the implementation and puts it aside and let you take the inspiration from DevOps, which I admire, as taking a data infrastructure as code and doing data pipelines as code, focusing developers on the logical design of the pipeline, and let the implementation do by configuration and declaration and not by code implementation, mainly because code is not adaptive enough to changes in data. Data changes too fast, the business questions changes too fast, and code is not adaptive enough to do that. So we're building a self-serve platform to help you do it in 50% less time, 50% less the people you need to design pipelines. And the nice thing about it, that it is built on, we're talking about Kubernetes today and the movement of monoliths to distributed technologies. It is built on the most modern technologies in the market, Kubernetes, Kafka, and more, integrated together and managed, and let you do pipelines, either if you are a small startup that needs quick and dirty, cheap, very flexible, but grow with the same platform to fully heavy load pipelines that need to be in production. So we have one platform that can grow with you and do data pipelines in order for data not to be spilled on the floor. That's what we do. We like data, we appreciate data, and I think that the domain is not mature enough to make value out of it. Jeff.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. How y'all doing? Awesome. I think I might get the award for the guy that traveled the furthest to this event. Anybody travel further than Phoenix, Arizona? Yes. Wait, San Francisco? I mean, come on, you're on the West Coast. All right, maybe he might have got me, but you've been here, so it doesn't count. You're from here, so... Hey, I would like to maybe take a quick survey, if I could, at how many people in the audience know of DigitalOcean. Just raise your hand. All right. Okay. That's better than I expected, quite honestly, because we have a lot of customers that don't know who we are. And by the way, my name is Jeff Latimus. I'm the Vice President of Global Sales at DigitalOcean. So it is a pleasure to be here, and I would like to thank all of you for being here as well, because I know it's kind of warm, but it's not as warm as what I came from. So I left 47, 48 Celsius the day I left Phoenix a week ago on Monday. So just a little touch on what DigitalOcean is all about. We are a cloud. We do not compete with the hyperscalers, while we do try to take their business, because we're all about this crowd right here. We're all about enabling developers, innovators, and SMB. We have zero focus on the big enterprise. So you are the individuals that we want to make successful. And how do we do that? We do that through simplicity, allowing you to get online and turn up a VM or what we call a droplet in a matter of minutes with simplicity. We provide you really outstanding support, whereas, you know, the big hyperscalers, are they going to pay attention to one or two developers out of their garage? Probably not. So those are some of the things that we do, as well as our costs are extremely competitive. We can probably save you anywhere from 30 to customers that have saved 80% over the big hyperscalers. So we're all about that enablement of developers, keeping things simple, and providing you outstanding support. So we hope that you'll come to DigitalOcean, give us a try. You're going to have some free credits leaving this event, so you have no excuse to not give us a try and see if you can be successful. And we will hold your hand through that journey to be what we call learners that come to DigitalOcean to kind of learn about developing and Kubernetes and volumes, whatever it may be. Then they become builders, and then hopefully become scalers when they become successful. So thank you, everybody, for being here. All the smart guys here are going to really, give you the details. And I don't know. I've talked to you before. Anyway, thank you all very much, and pleasure.
Cool. So as I mentioned, my name is Shani. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer for Bunnyshell. I'm actually an engineer by background, graduate of the Technion, but unless there's any companies developing an assembler or COBOL, that's probably where my skill set ends. Quickly moved to the business side of things, and the last 13 years I've been based in the Bay Area, Silicon Valley. Bunnyshell is actually my fourth dev tool company. I've been fortunate to have two companies that have exit, and so a little bit about Bunnyshell. Bunnyshell solves the problem but it worked on my local machine. So, for many of you, probably your developers are using a local Docker. It works fine. Then they push it into dev, and it doesn't work there. They spend a lot of time debugging and reworking the code, fixing it. Then they push it into staging. Staging is a different environment. Again, debugging, reworking the code, etc., etc. And so the fact that dev, staging, pre-production, and production are all different environments lead to your developers spending a lot of time reworking the code as opposed to getting it right the first time. And so what Bunnyshell does is we create full-stack production-like environments in the cloud that include all of your dependencies, your database with proper seeding, your API gateways, your microservices, of course, your cloud-native services, let it be Kafka, Apache, Redis, MySQL, etc. And so developers get to develop on realistic environments from day one, which means that they don't have to spend all of that time reworking the code as they move from, throughout the development pipeline. There's a lot of technology under the hood, like caching and auto-updating to avoid drifting. And of course, we take care of all the internal communication and ingress rules between the different microservices and the microservices and the cloud-native services, and exposing any endpoint, etc. But the bottom line is just developers get much more productive, much better developer experience, and they get more things done in the same time frame. So that's it. That's a little bit about Bunnyshell. Maybe a little bit of logistics before we get started. So we're going to spend about 45 minutes, kind of talking a little bit about shifting left, CICD, migration to containers, Kubernetes, etc. We're going to try and leave 10, 15 minutes for questions. And again, we're going to stay around. So if you have specific questions, the panelists are going to be there. If anyone needs restroom, second floor, just make sure you turn left and not right. Right is the security company. You don't want to go there. Left is Notorious. And I think that's about it. So let's get started. Cool. So just introducing the panelists from left to right, and maybe I'll let each person, say a few words about himself. So Oksana, you want to get started?
It's not left to right.
Sorry, right to left.
Is it what?
You think you push it up all the way?
This one is working, right? So I'm Roxana. I'm the Chief Technical Officer at Bunnyshell, and it's my first time here. I love it. If it weren't for the so many zeros in the rent prices, I would move here. I'm not sure if I'm a dev or an ops person at heart. I couldn't imagine my life without writing code, but I couldn't imagine my life without sniffing and how the deployment is made. So I guess I'm a DevOps at heart, and that's all about me.
Hi, I'm Avi. I'm VP R&D of Notorious. Oh, did you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Before Notorious, I was VP R&D at another startup company in the domain of blockchain security. And before that, I spent 13 years in the Israeli Prime Minister's office doing some technical and management roles, mostly in cybersecurity, data, and networks domains. That's it.
Hi, I'm Darian Wilkin. I'm a Senior Solutions Engineer at DigitalOcean. I've been at DO for a little over 6.5 years now, which makes me an absolute dinosaur in tech terms. But worn many hats at my time at DO, from support to writing documentation to now helping our business customers figure out how to navigate the cloud. It's very nice to be here, and very happy to be working with Notorious and Bunnyshell on this.
Okay, maybe we'll just... Okay. And as you can see, Darian is not Vasily. Unfortunately, Vasily got COVID and couldn't travel. And so Darian, we flew him over really... when did you land?
Yeah, found out on Thursday.
Okay.
Flew in on Saturday.
Yeah, so appreciate that. Maybe before we start, just to kind of sense the audience and, make sure we tailor the topic. So... just by a show of hands, how many companies are more than 10 developers? 10 developers or more. Okay. Keep your hands up. How many are 20 developers and more? Okay. 30 developers and more? Okay. Quite a few. 40 developers and more? Okay. So we got about 20% of the audience, 30 developers and more, and then the rest is somewhere between 10 and 30. Okay, great. So let's maybe start with our journey, and I guess there's quite a few, seed companies, 10, 20 developers, as you saw. So I'll start with kind of, probably the most important question. I got actually that question from a couple of people in the audience. So what's, typically you start, with a monolithic app, and then at some point you start breaking it up to microservices. So maybe we'll start with you there. And what's the right time to kind of, migrate to microservices, containers, what's the right driver?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's something that comes up for pretty much every company at some point, because it's simple to be simple, right? When you're starting out, you want to get the term minimum viable product, MVP, is everywhere these days, right? You want to get your MVP out that has the basic working version of your application so that you can show customers exactly what you plan to be able to do once you're a big boy company, so to speak. But once you get customers, as you're working towards scaling, it becomes pretty clear pretty quickly that Monolithic is going to carry with it some serious limitations in terms of how do you scale things, how do you deal with failures, things like that. Horizontal scaling is almost entirely out of the question, so we really only have vertical scaling, which means you're increasing the size of your resources, and at some point you hit a limit. And I think we've all seen with a lot of these, with a lot of instance sizes, with virtual machines especially, it's not, add 1 vCPU and 1 gig of RAM continuously. It's add 2, then 4, then 8, then 16. And so you get to a point with monolithic services where if you're trying to scale a little, you have to scale a lot, and it becomes very difficult to control your costs. So there comes an inflection point where you have to say, all right, we got to move off of this model of everything being concentrated in one single place. We have one single point of failure, or we're reliant on one single piece of hardware. We can't optimize our costs. How do we do this? And the problem is a lot of companies wait too long to get to that stage, and it gets harder and harder and harder the bigger you get, the more customers you have relying on you to make that switch without serious disruption to your business and reputational risk. So it's something that you don't necessarily have to, and I wouldn't recommend you necessarily try to build a complete microservice model from day one, because it can be challenging. It introduces some complexity. But I like to use the example of DigitalOcean. We have a very simple platform. We try and make things as easy to use as possible. If you've ever used AWS, you essentially have to get a 4-year degree to be effective with AWS. DigitalOcean was built as kind of a counter to that. We try and make things as easy to use as possible. Let people stand services up without much friction at all. And a lot of people think, okay, well, that must mean DigitalOcean has designed things to be super simple on the back end. But in fact, simplicity on the front end requires significant complexity on the back end. And that's why we partner with Bunnyshell and Datorios to work with our customers who are going through this transition process in their architecture, because it's not necessarily straightforward to understand how you need to do these things yourself. You oftentimes need partners to work with, to understand, to explain things to you, and to help you build those pipelines for data, for redundancy, for scaling. All these different things require a lot of thought, and they're necessary in the long term. But they can still present unique challenges. So that's one of the things I work with our business customers on all the time is hey, we're at this stage, we're at this inflection point where we need to figure out if we are going to spread out or if we're going to continue with this monolithic model. And almost never, when you get to that point, are you deciding, okay, we actually are going to continue with the monolithic model. There are so many drawbacks that it has. But it's intimidating to look at that and say, okay, well, when and how do we move to microservices? So that's certainly one of the questions that's why we have this talk today, right? It's not the easiest question in the world to answer.
Oksana?
So if you're at a stage when you're building the MVP or you're validating the product, you still have a lot to learn. So scalability, which is one of the greatest things that Kubernetes and microservice application bring, is not the biggest concern. The biggest concern is learning how your application should be. You write a lot of POCs that are not validated and you throw them away. If you consume lots of time to write the application as it to be scalable, but before even validating what you're writing, it's just going to create a lot of rework later on. Because if the company doesn't have experience with microservice application, then the possibility of making certain mistakes is pretty big. So I guess that at a later point, you will need to refactor some of the application. So in the first step, it's better to prioritize learning. If, however, the team has experience with microservices, then it's a very good idea to start with a microservice application, because you will save time from developers, because they won't they won't have the issues that monolithic applications bring. However, when it comes to containers, of course, you can have both containerized monolithic and microservices and not containerized monolithic and microservices. But with container, I do recommend starting it from day zero, because it solves half of it works on my computer. That's why containers were created. So there was a joke. So we can ship the developer hosts on production because we couldn't ship their host, and it was working only on their host. So with containers, I totally recommend starting from day zero. But with microservices, I recommend starting from what is called the day two. Day two is when you have a working product that you push to your clients, and scalability starts being an issue. And that's when you start thinking, okay, should I split my services in order for them to scale independently?
I'm going to make it hard for you guys. You mentioned challenges around scalability. What kind of challenges, are you guys hearing from your customers? Is it around endpoints not responding? Is it around, certain microservices crashing? What kind of challenges?
So, you have issues with scalability first when you can't scale a single component individually. So exactly like Darren said. So if you have a monolith and you have issues with one of the services, because it's a monolith, you will have to scale it together. Scaling it together means that the cost will increase a lot, and there might be resources that you want to containerize for a single application. So cost is one of the factors that non-intuitively, when you create microservices and you have to use certain services such as Kubernetes and you pay for that services, your costs go down. They don't go up, especially in high traffic campaigns where you have spikes. The second, when you know scaling is a problem, when you start seeing issues with responsiveness, and it's hard debugging it, it's hard coming with solutions, it's hard coming with rollback solutions, and it just affects both the production and the development flow. So if developers become unproductive, if they become frustrated, and if the production does not work great when you have unusual increases in traffic, it means that it has something to do with scalability.
Yeah, one of my favorite, I don't want to say favorite necessarily, but typically when we have a customer come to, I work with our business customers, like I said, to help them figure this stuff out. And so a lot of times for me, when this conversation comes up of how do we move to microservices is after an oopsie. Right after you've had your first major downtime because you had a failure, right? You had a failure on one of your services on your monolith. It took down everything else. You couldn't figure out what was going on because the whole thing was down, and you couldn't access a single service, or you couldn't figure out which log was relevant in this case, or whatever the answer may be. A lot of times it's because you were building on this one single machine. Everything was interrelated and impossible to separate when you were doing the troubleshooting. So we get a lot of customers who are like, look, whatever needs to happen, just tell us what needs to happen so that this doesn't happen again. And a lot of times the answer is, well, first you need to break things out apart from each other so that you have separate actual physical machines hosting your services, and then you need to horizontally scale, right? You need to have services that you can lose an individual service and still the other services will be able to take the load. It can take that individual service offline and troubleshoot it or just replace it. But absolutely, for me, the indicator is a customer's oh shit moment, so to speak. Pardon my French.
Awesome, great. Aviv, when did you guys start your journey to microservice containers, etc.?
Well, actually, we took a not so common decision and started using Kubernetes right from the start. The reason for that is that we had quite a solid vision as to the platform we were building. And we knew that both reliability and scaling going to take a major part in our solution. We could implement it as a monolith, and then later on cope with the challenges of switching it to a microservices architecture. But since we knew this point would come in the path, we decided to pay the price right from the start and save later.
Sorry, I didn't mean to. I wasn't trying to cut you off. I apologize. I was just trying to grab the mic. I like to hear myself talk. So, I think that paying the price is a good thing to think about here, because it's an investment. Essentially, is the way you should think about this sort of motion, right? When you're talking about bringing your services into microservices and breaking out of the monolith, it does take time, effort, and money. That's undeniable. It's going to increase your complexity a little bit. You're going to have to understand how services interoperate more, but it's an investment. All of those things are an investment in not having to worry about those things down the road when you're much bigger, when you've got much more customers relying on you, when they have higher expectations of your company, and when a single huge outage like that could be the end of the company in some cases, right? There are certain industries where you just can't have that sort of downtime. You'll lose your customers like that. Why would they stay with you if you haven't shown that professionalism and capability to build a resilient architecture when they can go with someone who has a proven track record of that sort of thing, right? So it's an investment that you have to make before the critical point, because once you get to critical points, it's a race against time. It's a fire drill, and nobody wants to be in that situation.
So Avi, sounds like you had some blisters from prior companies. So talk to us a little bit about some of those horror stories.
Okay, so during my previous roles, I had to switch a few systems from a monolithic architecture into a microservices architecture, and this process was really painful. I'll talk about a specific example when I had a really huge project that was really old and outdated. It was actually originally written before Kubernetes was created, and during the migration process, first of all, it took a lot of time. I think a bit more than a year to switch. And it was really painful. A lot of bugs in certain areas of the product. We had to rewrite everything, starting from the architecture itself. Because of that painful process, when I got to Datorius and had to choose my way, I chose to start with the microservices architecture, or at least, even if not to fully implement it, at least make the system microservices ready. So the migration in these areas that we won't split right from the start would be easier when we decided to completely move to that architecture. That's it.
Sorry. Again, I like the sound of my own voice. No, I think something that brings up there, which is really interesting, is the risk of the loss of tribal knowledge, right? When you build a new company and you've got everything on one monolith, and maybe you've got only 3 developers who worked on this entire monolith, one of those people leaves, and they may take with them so much knowledge about how the system is architected and built that the next people who come in, it's like they're walking into a room that's on fire already, right? So it's difficult for them to get their hands around. So that's another one of those inflection points where if you're at risk of losing those early stage developers who really got their hands around everything, if you're not in a microservice architecture by the time those people are filtering out of your company, then you can have a situation where nobody knows how things work, and you really have to break everything down just to understand and get your hands around it to keep it working in the future. So that's also another one of those risks you got to be aware of when you're looking at this transition phase.
I don't like the sound of my voice, but I'm gonna say something about this. It does not only refer to development, it also refers to DevOps team, and it's even more painful here because if you have one person or two person or an externalized team of DevOps that has written all the flows, all the internal scripts, and you're relying on that people because nobody knows what's there, if one of those people leave the company, then you will be in big trouble with the flows, which is why it's always recommended the flows that you're using for delivery, for integration. You have to maintain them, keep them up to date with the technology, not only working, even if they're working, if they're successful in what they're doing, keep them up to date and share them with the team. And I'll say some more words about DevOps as a culture and not DevOps as a role later on.
And Darian, I think we were on exactly that call a few weeks ago with someone that his DevOps person just left, and he was kind of trying to figure out, oh shit, what do I do? His DevOps person was working for 6 months on, that exact, scalability, etc., and then, he left. So, Avi, another question. So, you guys made an unusual choice to start with Kubernetes from day one. I know it's a tough question, but, did that decision pay off in your view, and if so, how?
Well, first of all, I'll say that there's no one correct answer for this question. It depends on a lot of things. But for us in Notorious, I think the short answer is yes. The decision paid off, and but the long and more accurate answer is that it depends on what part of the system we're talking about. I mean, in some areas, let's say one of the features of our platform is that it could be installed on any environment, whether it's cloud-based or on-prem. And regarding that feature, the decision paid off because we get that almost without doing anything, just by using Kubernetes as a wrapper for all of our components. But I'll say that in other areas, we had to change things in the system, and I think we left 2 or maybe 3 microservices out. We deprecated them and lost a lot of code that could be written a lot faster if we didn't have to do the entire work of creating this intercommunication between all these other microservices. So we could do it much faster, but I think overall the decision paid for itself. I would do it again if I had to choose.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that I want to touch on with that, specifically with Kubernetes, is we talk about. I think I've been focusing on the risk of your services going down and things like that. But to the point of scaling, right? Kubernetes has an advantage in that it can very easily automatically scale up once you've got everything configured. But I think the other scaling advantage that isn't talked about as much is the ability to rapidly scale down again, right? And I think we talk about the elephant in the room, which is that the global market is in a bit of a tizzy right now. It's not doing so well, and there are a lot of companies I know in the U.S. who are expecting for VC venture capital funding to be reduced in the near future, and as a result, they're looking at their runways. They're looking at the cash that they have on hand and saying this has to last us through whatever this period is in the tech market. And with that comes an optimization of costs, right? And it's possible to build a cost-optimized infrastructure without microservices. It's just a lot harder. It's a lot harder to do. But when you're on Kubernetes, I like to think of it as a graph with 2 lines, right? You've got this line that goes up and down. That's your usage, right? That's your customers coming onto your app. They're using it. Maybe you have one big spike a month, or maybe you have a spike daily. But then it goes back down at some point once your customers are offline in most cases. And then you've got this capacity line, right? This capacity line of how much infrastructure you have to have available. And that capacity line has to match the peak of your customer usage. Otherwise, you're going to be down at peak times, and nobody wants that. So you've in the old monolithic architecture style, you have this capacity line that's a straight line, and it has to be at the top of your usage all the time. And if you think about the space between those two lines, it's wasted money, all of it. Right, all the money that all the capacity that you have that you're not using right then is a waste. It's money that you are lighting on fire. I keep going back to fire. I don't know why fire keeps coming up, but that's wasted money. And Kubernetes has the ability for you to automatically scale down again, and in addition to scaling up rapidly when your customers come back online. So if you think of the distance between those two lines as wasted money, Kubernetes helps you minimize that distance as much as possible.
So, we keep referring to like microservices, containers, and Kubernetes in the same bucket, but I'm wondering if Kubernetes actually, has a different trigger and other reasons as opposed to, just breaking the application is one thing, and we talked to a lot of companies that break the application, but kind of taking the next step to Kubernetes is a big hurdle for them. So Roxana, what's kind of the trigger to Kubernetes?
So just to correlate with my first answer about when you start with microservices, if you passed the MVP and you have the scalability issue now, so Kubernetes should be first thing in your thought, because like Darian said, if you want to handle the scaling, there are hundreds of processes that you have to take care of, service discovery, communication, proxies, ingresses, health checks. There are hundreds of processes that you need to write that do nothing for your core business. So why not go with Kubernetes that can handle everything just through a YAML file? So you don't need to be a programmer. It's YAML. It's very easy to write. And it scales automatically. It integrates with the cloud. It integrates with DigitalOcean. It raises Droplets instances automatically when you need them. Because DigitalOcean has auto-scaling for instances. Sorry, I said it first. And it also raises the amount of applications of pods inside. And if the application architecture is microserviced correctly, like if you lose the coupling between the applications to let them be scalable by themselves, then Kubernetes will do everything from scaling to high availability to reliability. This kind of things will really make a big impact in how your product is seen by your customers. Some flows will even help you in reports that you have to make, even security. It does help you to know how your architecture functions. If you, at this point, maybe you're thinking of security certification is an issue if you want to go for a SOC 2 or an ISO. Well, even if you want to go, internal development and deployment processes are important in getting those kind of certification. So all in all, Kubernetes helps with lots of issues, not only scaling, and also a good thing like cost optimization. It also scales down. That's really important.
Awesome. So you migrate to Kubernetes. What do you use? Do you set up your own Kubernetes? Do you use a managed service? What's the plan here?
If your business doesn't provide Kubernetes as a service, there is no sane reason why you would want to manage the Kubernetes by yourself. I can't think of a reason. Maybe you can, but I can't. Because cloud providers offer managed Kubernetes. You got nothing to do. You just use it as a service. Because maintaining Kubernetes is not as easy. It's not that easy to use. But to architect, to maintain it, well, you need a certification for that. And all cloud providers, no, not all of them, but DigitalOcean does. That's what's important. Offers Kubernetes as a service. They scale automatically. They scale down automatically. Do you pay for the master node? You don't pay for the master node. I mean, you're getting it for granted. So there's no reason whatsoever to manage the Kubernetes by yourself.
Yeah, I hope nobody came to this talk expecting us to say, hey, this is a really easy process. Everything about this is super simple and easy, because it's not. But there's a difference between easy and necessary, right? The necessary thing isn't always the simplest thing. But to Roxana's point, this is one of those solved problems in terms of managing Kubernetes. You don't need to do it yourself. It's essentially masochism to run your own Kubernetes cluster at this point, unless you're really just interested in learning. But that's a great point. Is that if you can get your app containerized and you can then write a YAML file, you can use any managed Kubernetes service out there, ours included, and all these features that Kubernetes has are a basic part of those offerings, and so you don't have to worry about. It sounds complex when you talk about a design a system that scales up and down, but Kubernetes makes it super simple. You say, hey, over 80% usage on these pods, scale up. Under 50% usage, scale down. And Kubernetes takes care of the rest of the logic for you. I can talk all day about the Kubernetes scheduler and the autoscaler and things like that, but I won't put anybody. I'll try not to put anybody to sleep here. But it really is. That's my big object. I guess the thing I want to get across is, look, a lot of this stuff is complicated and isn't necessarily intuitive when you think about how you want to do these things long term, which is why it's important to find the right partners, right? It's important to find the right people who can help you through these processes, through your data orchestration, through your development environments, things like that, building these things out, setting these things up. Getting good advice from smart people who've been in the space, who understand what's going on. It's the most critical piece.
And one more thing that I want to add here is, now that using a managed Kubernetes solves the problem of maintaining the cluster, if you also want to use a third party like Bunnyshell, in our case, that make the transition to Kubernetes even easier by automatically transforming, for example, if you're using Docker Compose to Kubernetes directly, sets the ingress. Kubernetes is great. It's easy to achieve extremely complex processes such as scaling, but nobody says it's incredibly easy to use or to make it perfectly suitable for your application. Each application is different. It's exactly like a child, and it's our child, right? So if you can also use a service that creates the Kubernetes manifest and deploys it to Kubernetes, then you will have more time to concentrate on what really matters, which is the business itself.
Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit from microservices and Kubernetes to CI/CD. Avi, at what point did you guys introduce continuous integration? At what point did you introduce continuous delivery?
Okay, so we've started with CI right from the start, but as you can expect, at first it was really simple process, and as our product got more complex and the amount of developers in the company increased, we had to update and add a lot of features and additions to the CI. And that's an never-ending process. I mean, we are still doing it, adding features. But I think the right starting point is when you write your first line of code.
Yeah, I mean, this is another one of those kind of eat your vegetables moments, right? It's not necessarily pleasant to say, okay, we're going to put everything, in the right places, and we're going to set up Jenkins or whatever CI/CD pipeline you want to set up. It's not necessarily something that you want to focus on in the early days when you've got this idea in your head and you're really excited about how are we going to execute this, and the problems of the code are the most exciting part, not necessarily the DevOps process. But it's another one of those things where if you work with the right partners on this stuff, it doesn't have to be something that distracts you from what you're focusing on.
Do I answer?
Yeah, please.
So In my case, even I didn't recommend microservices from day zero, but I do recommend having a CICD from day zero. So from the moment that you start, that you have a code that you need to test or you have to deploy, you will do it manually for three times, maybe, until an enthusiastic developer starts writing the first bash script to automate or partially automate part of it. So there are tons of solutions for orchestrating those steps that build your application, test your application, and deploy your application. And it doesn't mean that you have to start complex from the start. You can work your app to a complex CI/CD that has automatic testing, security testing, integration, caching. But you can start from the build of the application to the deployment, and you'll work your way. But starting from when you have something to test, not even the production, I would totally recommend that. You will just save time.
I intentionally, by the way, separate between CI and CD. I think you're right about CI. I think a lot of the companies we talk to, up to the point where they have at least a dozen customers, they probably don't do CD, and when they do, it becomes very, very complex. And so again, I think that the answer is different for CI and for CD. We're going to open it up for questions in about 2-3 minutes. I just want to maybe ask 2 or 3 final questions before we open it up. So, Roxana, we break the application from Monolithic. We introduce Kubernetes. We introduce CI. We introduce CD. What's next? What's after?
So now you have the microservices, they're deployed on Kubernetes, they scale individually, and it works very nice. You have that satisfaction. Your production is not breaking anymore. So you have time for other concerns. You will always have concerns. But you have time now to look at your development process. So you tackled some of the things, but now there is the productivity issue. You want your development team to be productive. And if you end up with a lot of components because of the splitting, then you'll start seeing that developers have a hard time running everything on their local computer. It's hard to bring them up, and it's hard to make them be updated to the latest version. Also, if the application is cloud native, you're using managed databases, you're using services provided by the cloud, you won't be able to run them locally. So you'll mock them. You'll write certain components that behave like the cloud native services. And if you do that, which is the only way, you'll end up with the first problem. It works only on my computer. So this was the first problem that you had before containerizing your application. So the development flow needs to move to be compatible with your microservice application. And at this point, what your developers need is some kind of workspace that is production-like, that has all the components, that gets updated when your components get updated, that uses the same services like the production. And also they need on-demand replicas of the production that are integrated in your testing pipeline, because at this step you will want to go with an automatic testing pipeline. I don't know if you noticed, but companies are shifting to no QA. They're doing automatic testing. Everything is tested end to end. It's not a manual process, and a lot of companies are proud of that they are test-driven, and they view testing very important. So at this step, what developers want is what Bunnyshell calls environments, on-demand environments that are used remotely by developers, so they don't have to hold on their application. Environments that always are up to date on production, so they never drift from the production data, for the production components and production infrastructure, and automated parallel testing, each test with an environment that is production-like, that is a replica, that spins fast, even with every PR.
Avi, Darian, any other thoughts on that? What's like beyond Kubernetes? I'm sure Darian has something to say.
He always has.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts. A lot of them aren't super useful, but I can certainly talk about this. Yeah, I think it's about maturity, right? It's one of those maturity questions, and everybody has a different stage at which they need to introduce some of these things. But computers are just rocks we tricked into thinking. They have no idea what we intend when we put code into them. And so, just like that talking about the local development, the local environment problem, it's a huge issue, and it's one of the big things that cloud solves. Obviously, is if you can do it all in the cloud in the same environment, then you should be doing it all in the cloud in the same environment. To not do that is to introduce needless risk into your development process, risk that you will not catch something before it goes into production, and suddenly, again, that reputational risk of now everything's down, we're not sure why, we have to roll back. Do you have a good rollback process? How do you roll back? That's another one of those questions you have to consider, especially which is especially important if you are using those local development environments. So there's a lot of these, I go back to the eating your vegetables moments, right, where you're like, this is something that we are not super excited to figure out and implement, but it needs to get done. So I'm happy to talk to anybody who's coming up to that point. This is something I work with my customers on all the time. What do we need to focus on right now? Looking at our current architecture and the way we do our DevOps, what do you see as the biggest risks? And it's about lining up those risks and saying, this is the one we're going to tackle next. This is the one we're going to tackle after that.
So Avi, Roxana talked a lot about environments and the various dependencies. Database is one of those dependencies. Database seeding is, definitely important when you introduce environment for development purposes. Talk to us a little bit about kind of managing databases at early stage companies.
Well, first of all, as a manager of developers, there is a known fact. There is a lack of data engineers, and because of that, I think it's really important to use that resource wisely, and do the transform the work into something more efficient. The way to achieve that goal is. It can be achieved by doing some measures. The first one is to separate the logical definition of your pipelines from the implementation. This way, it allows you, first of all, to switch from one implementation to another in an easy process, and it also solves all the technical issues for your data engineers without requiring them to tackle each technical issue every time for every single instance of the pipeline. We talked earlier about scaling, so if you do that separation, that's something that you're going to get for free. I mean, just scale the required part, and the resources will move to that pipeline. Besides that, excuse me, I have to remind myself something. Okay, another point is the shift left. Is a very common concept when we're talking about security. But it's also valid when you're talking about handling data. You should always at least try to drop every unnecessary data at the first point that you can. The result of that is reduced costs and faster and easier processes, or a process of processing the data later on the pipeline. Besides that, like in many other technical problems, you have to choose the right tool for the job. There are many tools out there to handle data processing, and when you choose the right one for you, you have to consider a lot of characteristics of your problem. the amount of data that you expect your pipeline to handle, the peaks and the dips of the throughput, the amount of pipelines, the different pipelines you have, what are the technical skills of the team that's building and maintaining this pipeline. I think it's very important to match the tools for the right job. That's it.
Okay, last question before we open it up for the audience. So there were a couple of companies that, are kind of at the realm of 40, 50 developers. 40, 50 developers is the point that you start measuring, productivity of developers, etc. So I guess, what do you start measuring at that point? Maybe we'll start with you, Darian.
Yeah, this is one of those kind of controversial questions, right? Because you can pick one developer who says these particular metrics are important. You find another developer. I mean, honestly, you ask any developer, you probably ask 50 developers, you get 50 different answers to this question, right? But I think, from my perspective, working with these companies, when we talk about development and the processes, for me, the first thing I look at is how often are we having failures, right? How often are we actually having a test that's failing in the pipeline? How often are those failures not getting caught is really the most important question, right? How often is something making it all the way through to production and then we catch it there? What do we need to do to rewrite the tests or to figure out how to preclude this problem in the future? It's not an easy question to answer. It's certainly, I think, one of the things you shouldn't do is just say, okay, well, how many pull requests is this person making, right? That's not necessarily a good indicator of the efficacy of the code that they're putting out, but it's a holistic process. It's something you need to work with your developers on to understand, how effective they're being around failures. What is happening when there is a delay in code being pushed out? That's a huge indicator, right? Like if you have expectations for something to get done in a certain time and it's taking a lot longer, what are the reasons for that? What are the delays that we have in our expectations on our sprints or whatever they are versus what's actually happening? If you're consistently 2 weeks behind what you expect, you're obviously measuring things in a way that's not giving you accurate results. You need to work on that, and I think the key is communication with your developers around that and understanding exactly how they're working and going to conferences so you can understand better development practices.
You want to take it?
Yeah. There are lots of metrics that you can measure, and there are a lot of categories of metrics. There is code quality, like simplicity, like extensibility, and there is application metrics that you need to measure, like responsiveness and scalability. And as your team grows, you will start needing to measure the productivity in your software development teams. So in productivity, what's important is that you have objective metrics, exactly like you said. You can't measure the lines of code that you're writing, how many PRs you're doing. It's not right. A line can do the things that 20 lines do if you're using a syntactic sugar weird Python thing. But that's not the point. The point is you have to measure it objectively. And the metrics that I recommend and I propose are called DORA metrics. So DORA metrics stand for DevOps Research and Assessment and were created by Google research team. And they measure objectively the performance in delivery engineering teams. And they have 4 metrics for that. So they measure the deployment frequency. And deployment frequency rate refers to how many successful deployments you do from all the deployments that you do, right? So you can do a lot of deployments and you can say that you have a high velocity, but if each and every deployment that you do will introduce a certain bug, then it's not objective. So deployment frequency, and there is mid time to recovery, which means after you've done a deployment that impaired the system or failed and introduced a bug, what is the time for you to recover the system? And this is very important. It tests your rollback system. It tests your flow. So it's not only about measuring the individual performance, but also the operation performance. And there is lead time to change. From the moment you start writing for a certain task, how much time does it have to pass for that specific task you're working on to be ready to be deployable in production? So this is kind of similar to the definition of done, which we know is very important to get straight in a development team. And there is the fourth metric, change failure rate, which after you've done a deployment, what is the rate in which the fixes, the hot fixes that you do after the deployment will introduce more bugs? This measures the productivity and the quality of the code that your development team writes. So these four metrics, and they are called DORA metrics. And I think is that Bunnyshell when you can measure how many environments are created and the deployments that are gone to staging and production, we can also display these metrics so you have a better understanding of where your team is at and what it must do to improve.
Awesome. I think we spoke quite a lot, especially Darian. So maybe we'll open it up for questions. I'll let, if you have a question, just raise your hand. Questions. Okay, over there at the back. Let's see if I can get all the way to you.
Hi, Tomer from Woodspoon. Thank you, first of all, for your time. We're in the process of breaking up our monolithic service into microservices. We're already Dockerized and the CICD is running and everything is great. And I have two questions about the breaking down of the monolithic service. First is a technical question, and the second is more of like, how do you explain or give the motivation to the business side to put in the time and effort and money into this? Because I find that sometimes as a backend team lead, I want to do it the right way, but it's not always the right way in terms of business in the company. So that's one question, is how do you explain, other than the idea I got from you of oopsie, creating an oopsie, which kind of explains it, but if I don't want to shut down the whole operation, how do I make the business side realize that it's the right way to go? And in a more technical perspective, once you do have this huge monolithic service, how do you recognize the best parts in it to start breaking them down into services, right? Like right now we have maybe 3 services that we broke down. One is the search service, another is the authentication service. And I try to take services that don't require the data that sits inside the monolith, and also that are really, really well, they can be separated really easy, but it's not always easy to find those parts. So I was wondering if you have like some tips on how to find those.
Tomer, I forgot to tell you we're recording the session, so I would be careful introducing any oopsies in the next couple of weeks. Darian, you want to take that?
So much good stuff there, and I appreciate you asking the question. So first of all, I'd like to tackle the how do you convince the business leaders part of it, and pretty simply fear. Right, that's what I would use. No, but seriously, when you're talking to your business leaders and they're saying we don't have the budget for this, they're considering a risk of spending too much money and time and effort on things that could be better spent on other things, right? Like we talked about, the core of your business, core things that your business sees as critical to their success. But I like to think of myself as almost a hitman. I get brought into meetings with developers and their business leaders, and they bring me in so I can explain to their business leaders that they are essentially walking on a tightrope, right? And that at any moment that they could trip and fall, and their entire business, and this is the crux of it, is their entire business is gone, off the internet, wiped out, doesn't exist. Customers can't find any information, right? Can't access their stuff, can't see what's going on, because you're all centered on this one piece of hardware or this one application that's got a single point of failure, and you haven't planned for what happens if that actually does fail. So yeah, I mean, it is a bit of a joke, but seriously, strike fear into their hearts with the threats that you make about what could happen if you don't invest in this now. It is something that does require investment. It requires work, but it's also something that I use the term risk, right? Risk is something business leaders typically understand. You are increasing your risk of losing customers, of being down indefinitely, because you are not investing in this time. And as soon as you put it in those terms, then it makes it clear that if they are down in the future, that it's because they made that decision not to take them down. And I find a lot of business leaders suddenly have a change of heart when it's going to be their fault that the business is down. So that's one big aspect of that I like to talk about. I don't want to continue to steal it forward. Anybody want to take the technical question at all? Yeah, why not?
Well, I do want to take the technical, but I want to take the first question as well. I think that business leaders work great with numbers. Some of them might work with emotions, but they work great with numbers. So as long as you are objectively measuring the defect rate and the how testing is made, how many failures enter, the rollback process, and you're motivating those measurements based on, well, the application is hard to maintain. I can't hire anybody because they don't want to work with old technology. It's hard to do deployments with monolith applications. So metrics speak for themselves. So, and that's another solution if fear doesn't work, maybe. But you can start with fear. As from the technology, how do you know that you've split them right? So, you know, there is one thing that I love about Unix, and do one thing well. This is one of the things that will help you split your application. And the second is go with scalability. Is it okay for this component to scale by itself? And if you think that in that component you would want a certain process to scale by itself, that you need to split it forward. So scalability and this line of thought would help you, will help you split the application.
I was going to say to touch on one more thing you talked about. You're absolutely right that one of the first things you should focus on when you're looking to split up a monolithic application is state. Right, so we talk about state versus stateless parts of your application. State is things like databases, file storage, media storage, all those other things that obviously they have data that is written to them that you don't want to lose, right? To the point about throwing away data you don't need, right? It's important to understand the line between what is stateful in your application and what is stateless. Stateless applications are dead simple to move out of your monolithic application. They're super easy. I mean, I don't want to oversell it, right? There is some complexity here, but as compared to the stateful applications, the stateless applications are so much simpler to move out. They're so much simpler to scale horizontally than the stateful applications. So that's absolutely where I would start when you're talking about breaking a monolith down into microservices, is draw a line in your architecture between your state and your stateless services.
I have one thing to add regarding your first question about the way to convince your managers to give you the time to change the architecture. Well, it's kind of a cliche, but I think the honesty is the best policy, and the implementation of that would be by introducing the different options. I mean, let's say you need to develop some new feature, and in your current monolithic architecture, it takes, I don't know, 2 weeks to develop it. the other option, let's say you were already in a microservices architecture, I think it would cost less because the overall maintenance and the deployment time would be much less. I think that once you show these numbers to your managers, they'll be able to decide if that's the right time for them to invest.
Yeah, but the first couple of services, let's say I'm introducing a new
Yeah, of course. Of course, there is the initial time to switch to the new architecture, but in the long run, it'll cost less, and that's something that you should allow your managers to decide. I mean, it's not that obvious that your current that the time is right to make the switch currently. I mean, just show the data to your managers and let them decide when it's right for the company.
One more thing, I swear. That's a great point about the initial. How do you convince them? It's easier once they see the benefits, but until you see those benefits, how do you do it? And I would say this is one of those parts where the convincing shouldn't necessarily be that we should do this. It should be we should find some partners who can help us do this. Right? Yes, you will learn a lot throughout that process, but your company may not want to spend the money just for you to learn over a 4-week period all the pitfalls of containers when you could, in 1 week, learn all those pitfalls from experts who can, it'll cost you a little more, but it'll significantly reduce the risk of this extending into a multi-month process, right? Again, I'd go back to the risk aspect of that. Just say, hey, let's hire somebody who knows what they're doing, who can help us through this process, who can answer the basic questions that we have and give us best practices advice, strong opinions that we can hold, right? Just give us opinions about how we want to do this, and then we will be better off in moving forward with this process.
As someone who's been a business leader in a C-level in probably 5 companies, and I can tell you that each of these companies we had the same challenge. I want to give a different perspective. I disagree a little bit with Darian and with Roxana about the fear. At least, on me, it never worked. But what did work is, many times we got to the point where, this feature would have taken X amount of time, and if you add another 20%, we can actually break the service and also, develop that feature. Now, the first feature, the second one, probably, we would choose the shortest path. But by the third time or the fourth time, we would actually choose the other direction. So that was one, and then the other thing is just experiencing the pain. You face those challenges with one customer, with another customer, and then at some point it gets to the point that you say, okay, well, I guess we just have to, refactor, we have to migrate, we have to introduce microservices. So I think it's just about, it's also a journey, and you don't get from 0 to 100 on, in one step. You have to take different steps, and again, at some point, just the business is forced to do that. So that's been my experience, at least on the business side. Any other questions? Yeah, please.
I can do a question. Hi, so my name is Zaur. You guys have been talking about moving to microservices a lot from the standpoint of cost reduction and scalability, and that kind of feels like a straw man to me, because the real alternative is not having one huge server that hosts both my app and my database. It's like being hosted on Heroku or something similar like that, where I have one monolithic web thing and one monolithic tasks handling thing, and outside services for storing my data in caches and so on. And it's more or less the same in terms of hosting costs. And like how I understood I should be thinking about when to switch to microservices is more in terms of Conway's law, in terms of like I have different teams and I want to decouple the release management and like the life cycle of different systems. Can you say a little more about that and how you've experienced it? Thank you.
Oksana, I think this question is for you.
Thank you. You should join the panel here. So yes, we talked about scalability when like being one of the first motivators on why you would want to go to microservice application and then on Kubernetes. But of course, there is certainly the coupling between applications that you want them to be loose. So, and the examples are very simple. In a monolithic application or in an application that scales with all the components, the communication is straightforward in the sense that it lies in the same pack. A service receives a request and it immediately sends it to the request that it lies in the same package because it's a monolith application. In a microservice application, the components are loose coupled, which means that they have different ways of communicating, such as event-based communication. What happens here is that you afford to lose one service, because what happens is that if you queue the messages that come to one component and you queue them and they are meant to be sent to another component, if that component is not up and running at that moment, it will be brought up by the orchestrator, and then it will start consuming the messages. Whereas if you are monolithical, and yes, you can split the monolithic application and you can do horizontal scaling, if that requests come to a component and the component goes down, then you lose the message, you lose the transaction. It might be a database transaction, it may be a pay order. So yes, besides scalability, which is the first thing that comes into mind when going to microservices, the second thing that you look at is this loose coupling and the benefits that you take from it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a good point, right? I'm an infrastructure guy, so I see that's where I'm coming from when I talk about scalability and things like that. That's typically the problems that my customers are facing. But I would say absolutely, for me, the two things are scalability and reliability. But there are other reasons that you would move to microservices. Now, I think microservices itself is maybe an overloaded term at this point, right? What I like to focus on is let's make sure that you're not spending too much money and that your application doesn't have a single point of failure. Those are the two things that I'm concerned about. And Heroku, they obviously provide a level of abstraction that allows you not to worry as much about the failure of services, but still you want to have a lot of times multiple services so you can have one go out and not to Roxana's point, lose that data, right? If you have one thing that all your data is going through and that single thing goes down, then your entire application is down. Whereas if you have multiple paths of success and in your application, then you don't necessarily have as significant a risk of your entire application being reliant on that one piece of hardware. But to your point, when it comes to development processes, it absolutely as well can help you with your development processes to split things out, because your individual developers don't have to worry about the parts of the application that they are not directly involved with in most cases.
And it's also beneficial to testing, because you can test each component separately, and that helps a lot.
I would say personally for us, a lot of the, I would say 70-80% of the prospects and customers we talk to, it's really about conflicts between one team and another, and dependencies between one team and another, and one team writing code and merges that, and another team's code is drifting, and those sort of things. So I think it's about like 15-20 developers that those teams start to experience those challenges. I think we're pretty much out of time, so just maybe one or 2 points about logistics. We're actually recording this panel, so we'll send you a the recording over the next couple of days. I appreciate everybody being here. It's so late, but nice breeze, and so hopefully you enjoyed that. Stay around. There's some more food, drinks. The panelists are going to be here if you have specific questions. And thank you, Avi. Thanks, Roxana. Thanks, Darian. Darian, I think you actually own the mic, so thank you. Have a great night, and thanks for coming. Thank you.